Again, I'm Lisa Broderick, Executive Director of Police to Peace. Extremism and terrorism are not reserved for one ideology or another, or for one country or another. Today, we're going to hear about the state of the global terrorist and extremist threats around the world, and also what it means for us here in the US. So while information about the state of the global threat environment may be interesting to you, we realize you don't work outside the US. But today, the world is almost boundaryless. So here's a direct connection in why this content matters. It's boundaryless, especially as it relates to social media. Someone can be radicalized in seemingly any American community by another person who may be in the Middle East. Just last Friday, a New York man who supported ISIS was arrested in an alleged plot to kill cops and the mayor during the St. Patrick's Day parade. Undeterred after questioning, the suspect's conduct escalated while he continued to assure police his threats would be carried out. So consider this. In some sense, the most dangerous people in the world may be young men who are broke and alone. Men whose poor economic and social circumstances lead them to be vulnerable to radicalization by violent ideologies, both online and in person. Sound like the Middle East? Well, it is, and it's also increasingly occurring here in the US, because the basic conditions for radicalization and terrorism are the same both globally and right here. Moreover, the diaspora of people leaving their countries to escape terrorism is resulting in growing immigrant communities in many American cities. These growing communities are still at odds with their terrorist environments in their home countries, which may profoundly affect them right here in the US. So despite current efforts to interrupt domestic terrorism and address the threats posed by individuals who risk moving towards violence, local law enforcement agencies often lack sufficient infrastructure or capacity to adequately deal with these growing threats. We'll come back to this at the end of the session when you'll hear from Chief Jim Bierman, who spoke a moment ago, provide a few comments about increasing your knowledge about threats to employ locally. And now I'll introduce the professionals from the Institute for Economics and Peace, beginning with the Director of the Americas, Michael Collins.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we're dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, an achievable measure of human well-being and progress. So we do this primarily through quantitative reports. These can be global in nature, they can be thematic, they can be country-based. Our flagship report is called the Global Peace Index, which measures levels of peacefulness around the world. We produce an ecological threat report, a positive peace index, a couple of things that may be particularly relevant to the participants today. Other forms of consultation work, for example, include the homicide data quality index that we did for Latin America. We're just approaching now the second round of an international security and policing index as well. An example of some of the current conversations with the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, who are looking to better ascertain the impact of their alternative dispute resolution programs, for example. We're doing training for a number of police forces in Mexico and have worked with the military in Mexico as well. In fact, just last week, we were presenting findings from this year's report at the Pentagon here in Washington, DC. So, you know, when we talk about globally comparable data, and today is going to be largely, globally focused, it can be exceedingly difficult, especially when you're trying to consider many, many different countries. I mean, starting from the fact that definitions in countries, let alone within states, can be, radically different. Now, terrorism is no exception to that. As you all know, there's no universal definition of terrorism, but in comparison to some of the other data that we manage, the data on terrorism is actually quite rich. So we look forward to sharing those key findings today. Now, just a point to note, and my colleagues will be expanding on this, only 0.6% of all terrorist attacks in 2022 actually happened in what we would call the West, right? Largely Europe and North America. But at the same time, any single attack, and thank God, Lisa, of course, that attack that you were talking about didn't happen, but any single attack can radically affect the spirit and the body of a country. So, through today's presentation, essentially, we hope to sort of, frame the US in the global context, providing some relief to a certain extent, but also providing a deeper sort of understanding of the risk that we may have at home. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce my two colleagues who are going to be joining us today. Brianna Tando, IEP Research Fellow, Intelligence Analyst, former Intelligence Analyst at the Police Department of New South Wales in Australia, and Serge Strubans, who's our IEP Director in Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. He's our resident counterterrorism and security expert and former Lieutenant Colonel with the Belgian Army and with NATO as well. So, Brianna, handing it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I will just share the screen. Lisa, I think you might have to enable me to share the screen.
I have done so.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, let me just take this back to the beginning. All right, I'm hoping everyone can see that. Okay, so the 2023 GTI, let's dive straight into it. So Michael's already covered this sort of section about who we are as an institute, but I'll just do it very quickly. So the Institute for Economics and Peace aims to create a paradigm shift in the way the world thinks about peace. We're an independent non-for-profit think tank dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace, as well as identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. Right, so I'll jump straight into what the Global Terrorism Index actually is. So the GTI is now in its 10th edition. It ranks 163 countries, or 99.7% of the world's population, according to the relative impact of terrorism. So the GTI itself is actually used as an indicator in our flagship report that Michael mentioned, the Global Peace Index, to measure the 5-year impact of terrorism, the residual impact across the country on peacefulness. So this here gives you a bit of an indication as to how we actually measure terrorism and the impact of terrorism through our methodology. You can see our definition of terrorism here on the screen. Basically, to sum it up, it basically doesn't include state-acted, perpetrated incidences. So we only focus on violence perpetrated by non-state actors, whether for or in opposition to established authority, with the intention of communicating a political, religious, or ideological message. We use data collected by a company called Dragonfly through its terrorism tracker database. Basically, what we do is we run this through 4 indicators: the number of incidences, injuries, deaths, and hostages, measured over a 5-year weighted average, to come up with our GTI score, which measures that 5-year weighted average and the impact of terrorism. So onto our results for this year's index. You can see here, this map shows you the GTI score, and it's measured through, sort of, as you can see here, the dark red colors are the higher impacted countries through to the green countries, which are lower impacted. You can see here that the higher impact is largely concentrated over sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly the Sahel region. So then you've also got smaller sort of epicenters there over South Asia, and particularly the border there between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the highlights for this year's report, we basically found through the data that there was no improvement in terrorism over the last 3 years. So terrorism has largely remained quite static since about 2020. So we had a bit of a peak in about 2015, 2016 in terrorism, and then successive significant decreases over the next couple of years to 2020, where it's largely remained static. This is highlighted in the number of countries recording terrorism deaths, which have remained pretty much unchanged since 2020, from about 43 countries recording deaths to 42 in 2022. We've got 25 countries this year that improved compared to 24 that deteriorated, continuing that theme of no improvement, basically. Or not much of an improvement compared to the deteriorations. And you've also got sub-Saharan Africa recording the largest increase in deaths, which rose by 8%. As I said earlier, the Sahel is the epicenter of terrorism, where 43% of global terrorism deaths occurred this year. And on the other hand, you've got deaths in MENA, or the Middle East and North Africa region, continuing to decline. So they're down about a third over the last year. So it sounds a bit strange to say, but terrorism is becoming more effective, with attacks killing 26% more people per attack. This is largely driven by groups such as Islamic State and Al-Shabaab, which are concentrated in the Sahel region. Suicide deaths or attacks, deaths committed through suicide bombings, rather, in the Middle East and North Africa have dramatically decreased. So they're down from about 2,000 deaths in 2016 to about 6 in 2022. Islamic State and its affiliates, the deadliest group, and they continue to be so. This is about the 8th consecutive year. They recorded about 2,000 deaths in 21 countries. Just shows you the spread across the globe of their reach. And that has largely remained the same over the last couple of years as well. And the Balochistan Liberation Army, or the BLA in Pakistan, is the fastest growing group with 233 deaths, which is a 9-fold increase since 2021. So this map is pretty similar to the earlier one that I showed you, but it shows you the locations of the terror attacks in 2022. So you can see there that there's a large concentration of terror attacks, if not the most concentration, over Burkina Faso and Mali in West Africa. We've also got smaller concentrations, like I said, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and also down through the Horn of Africa. So there's two fundamental considerations that you need to sort of frame the 2023 GTI through. The first being that the Taliban, according to our definition, which no longer includes state actors, well, it doesn't include state actors, the Taliban now being a state actor in large concentrations of Afghanistan is no longer included as a terrorist organization. So that's really driven deaths, or deterioration in deaths. So deaths are down 9% over the last year. However, if we excluded Afghanistan from the global total, deaths would have been up by 4%. So it shows you that continuation of terrorism as a threat to global security and safety. Islamic State is also claiming less attacks, especially in the Sahel region, with Islamic State deaths down 16% in the last year. However, there is a little bit of a data quirk there. So there's a group called Unknown Jihadists, which is basically capturing across the globe those terrorists which don't align particularly with Islamic State or don't claim to be a member of Islamic State or Al-Shabaab or any other group. So those attacks, if they were to be included in the global total of Islamic State deaths or any other group, then deaths would have actually increased in the Islamic State group. This just reinforces an earlier point I made about sub-Saharan Africa being the only region to deteriorate in 2022. You can see that displayed in this graph, everything else has improved. So these are the countries most impacted by terrorism in 2023, and they've largely remained static over the last 5 or 6 years. Those countries do have some movements within the index, but they have largely been at the top of the index for the last 5 or 6 years. So you can see Afghanistan continues to remain the most impacted country by terrorism for the 4th consecutive year now. With the Taliban being sort of removed from the index by definition, this is expected to decline, and Burkina Faso and other countries in the Sahel, particularly Mali, are expected to rise in the index. And you can also see improvements in MENA reflected in the movements in the top 10, with Iraq improving by 5 places this year. The 5 countries at the top of the index account for the bulk of terrorism deaths, with deaths in those 5 most impacted countries increasing by 8%. Deaths across the globe outside of these 5 countries fell by 26%. So it really shows you that concentration of terrorism within the top half of the index, within those 5 countries there. Deaths from terrorism, again, it shows you the top 10 and the concentration within the top 10 there. So you can see Burkina Faso and Mali account for 17 and 14% respectively of terrorism deaths across the globe, while the rest of the world outside the top 10 only account for 15%. So these are the large trends that we've sort of tracked since 2007, rather, at the beginning of the Terrorism Tracker database. So this graph here really shows you that terrorism in the Sahel is becoming, the Sahel itself is becoming the epicenter of terrorism. As you can see, basically from about 2017 onwards, it's really taken up the bulk of terrorism deaths. But I'd also like, and more importantly for I think our audience, I'd like to point to the bottom blue graph there, where you can see terrorism deaths have really remained static at about 2,000 deaths since 2007. And that really includes some of our reach, as well as obviously that top blue bar as well, which includes Europe and North America, but also parts of the West. Really, terrorism remains a threat still in these areas. So you can see Europe and North America at the top with the dark blue. It's dropped off for the most part. Obviously, with the scale of this graph, it's hard to tell exactly how much it's dropped off and where we are at the moment, but it's still there. It very much is still there. This is the deadliest terror groups. At the bottom there, you can see Islamic State, like I said, continues to be a threat across the globe, active in 21 countries. You've got Al-Shabaab, which is active in the Sahel, and most of these groups, in fact, that are pointed out are active in the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of the BLA in Pakistan. This table sort of ties in our other reports. So we produce a couple of other reports yearly. I mentioned the Global Peace Index, but I also should mention the Ecological Threat Report, which basically measures the impact of climate change and ecological threats across the globe, but also our Positive Peace Index, which largely measures a few other things, but in this particular instance, it measures resilience level. And the ability of countries to cope with shocks such as climate change and also terrorism. So this table here shows you the top 10 countries at the top of the GTI index and the ecological threats they face. So you've got 8 of the 10 countries suffering from the worst terrorism also face extreme water shortages and high population growth, but they also have low resilience levels. So it really shows you that it's just like a systemic approach to terrorism and a systemic approach to any of these issues that I'm showing on the screen here is really what should be taken in order to address these. We can't really address terrorism without addressing, particularly in the areas where it's most impacted, such as the Sahel, without addressing these issues here, such as population growth and water risk and natural disasters and things like that, and also their low resilience levels. So we really need to build up all of these, so build up resilience levels, but also manage ecological threats in order to manage terrorism in much of these areas. So now what I'll do is I'll hand over to our Director of Europe and MENA, Serge, and he will cover a couple of key regions and particularly the West, which will be of interest, obviously, to our audience here.
Thank you very much, Brianna, and thank you also for continuing to making this PowerPoint move forward. So next, please. So when we look at terrorism in the West, this is, of course, a graph showing you the evolution since 2007 also, and it's absolutely comparable to the trends that we have seen worldwide. I think I would like to come back to a remark made by Michael Collins during this introduction. This is representing less than 1% of the terrorist attacks in the world. So compared to the figures that Brianna has shown to you, the figures about the number of incidents and casualties are absolutely marginal compared to the figures that we just received. When we speak about the United States, for example, it's 19 casualties last year compared to the 6,000 worldwide, and it's about the same level for Europe. So clearly, in the numbers, something absolutely marginal when it comes to the number of attacks and casualties. What this graph is also showing us is that since 2015, there have been more and more ideological terror attacks than religious attacks. So clearly there, since the peak of the IS and since the start of the security crush on Daesh in Syria and Iraq, but also in other places of the world, you have seen that the impact of terrorism linked to religious background has decreased in the number of attacks, and therefore you see many more attacks with an ideological background. You can translate this into political backgrounds, and you can translate this into attacks coming from far left movements and from far right movements. So today we see a clear predominance of those attacks compared to religious attacks. Next. But when you look at the casualties that those attacks create, when you will clearly see also there that over a period of time, of course, of 15 years, we have seen that religious attacks have created many more casualties than those other, I would say, reasons for the use of terrorism. Political attacks has created at about half of the casualties of religious attacks, but you need to understand when you look at this, as I explained to you before, far left, far right, that those ideologically motivated casualties, well, could be almost completely linked to far right attacks. When you look at far left attacks, of course, they come quite often in the news and they are repeated quite often. to generate some form of publicity around the cause and around their movements, well, they will never aim at creating casualties. Only I would say, the destruction of infrastructure, destruction of processes, but never really with the intention of harming or killing anyone. So what you see there, religious, as clearly the Salafist, jihadist movements active in the West. Ideological, those are far-right movements active in the West, and the rest clearly unclear also. So in the modus operandi for the far left, no casualties are foreseen, but therefore a high number. And you will see that throughout the Western world, definitely in Europe, well, some governments will focus on the number of attacks because they want to break this cycle of publicity for, as a government, while others, like France, for example, will still continue to concentrate on the number of casualties created by those groups. Next. So when we look at this, clearly what I explained, so last year we had in the West 15 ideologically motivated attacks, only 3 religiously motivated attacks in 2022. We have seen in the past decade that there have been over 3 times more ideologically motivated attacks than religiously motivated terrorist attacks. Last year, only 8 attacks in the US, not really tied to a group, for a total of about 19 casualties. So that's about 10 more than the year before. Of course, when you are so low in numbers, each increase is really like incredible. But well, those 10 casualties are linked to this one attack in Buffalo, which was, of course, a racist attack, but with a far-right background, as we have found manifestos and also a lot of videos pointing out to a far-right terrorist group, what is far-right ideology in the preparation and the execution of this attack in Buffalo. In the UK, for example, so we're coming back to Europe, only 4 attacks in the UK, no death in the UK for the first time since 2008. So we clearly see the fruit of different actions. Of course, this security crush of large international terrorist organizations, such as the Islamic State and other organizations, which of course cannot commit in the West anymore, these largely organized attacks. And on the other hand, we also see enhanced collaboration, enhanced information and intelligence exchange between intelligence services, but also counterterrorism services within the Western world, so to speak. And of course, new legislation, especially focusing on money laundering and financing of international terrorist groups, which are of course targeting the capacity of those groups to be active in all parts of the world. Next. And next, so if we shift to the Sahel, the epicenter, what we see there, and this map is really interesting, we see one thing, is this migration from the Middle East, North Africa, to countries like Iraq and Syria. And we see that Iraq is really improving well, and Syria is, of course, a little bit behind there with the conflict, which is still active in this region. And of course, the earthquake, which took place in this region about, now close to a month ago, well, it happened exactly in Syria, in this part of Syria, where there's still a lot of conflict, still a lot of terrorism being used. So that might have an impact, further impact also in the future weeks and months. We also see the crush that has been put on Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, but therefore the spread of, I would say, terrorist agenda in what is called the Sahel, focusing on basically 2 countries, which would be Burkina Faso and Mali, but you also see that in surrounding countries and also countries surrounding the Sahel as such, you will see that there is an impact on those countries. For example, countries like Togo and Benin, those 2 countries just to the west of Nigeria, well, they start to be impacted also. We see that coastal areas like countries like Guinea, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire are becoming very nervous about this spread of terrorism in this region, because it is known that within the framework of a crime or organized crime terror nexus, well, those terrorist groups would like to ensure to have an access to the sea, to have access to the ocean, to basically facilitate trafficking coming out of Central and Southern America through West Africa, up north, North Africa, Europe, and of course also within Central Asia and parts of Asia. It is a well-known trafficking route of any sort of people, money, weapons, drugs, or whatever. They want to facilitate the access to organized crime in this region, because there's a clear connection between organized crime and those international terrorist groups, basically financing terrorist activities through facilitating organized crime in the region in which they are active. This is also showing us that, when you put a security crush on such organization, well, they are very flexible and very opportunistic, and they will just look for other regions with a fertile soil for their ideology, a fertile soil for their business model. So basically countries in which there is a low level of resilience, like lack of governance, and of course already some form of destabilization, which they will aggravate and enhance to basically create an environment in which they can thrive. So clearly at the Institute for Economics and Peace, when we look at this, how we want to approach this is a double approach: mitigate the impact, and of course with the data-driven research that we are producing, that's how we collaborate in mitigate the impact of terrorism, and on the other hand, by training in positive peace, looking at institutions, structures, and attitudes which create more peaceful societies. Where this is how we want to increase the resilience of those countries to face several shocks, as Brianna has said, but clearly also the impact of violent extremism, which could of course lead to terrorism. What we see in this entire part of the world, and of course the intersection of all those strategic factors influencing peace and security, well, we see clearly the systemic challenges. Therefore, we are more than happy to provide systemic analysis, which could of course lead to systemic solutions. If you want to find a solution for those countries, you will need to come with a very whole of government, a very holistic approach, making sure that you tackle all those strategic factors leading to violence. And we see a clear interconnection between violence and the majority of those factors also. And of course, you need to recreate resilience. So we need to build up those nations from the, I would say, from the bottom, from the basis, to make sure that they will be more stronger facing those external and internal shocks. Next. Well, when you look at the evolution of the past 15 years in this part of the world, you clearly see an increase. I must say, starting in the beginning of the 2010s, but definitely through the peak in 14, 15, you see an increase of the impact of terrorism in sub-Saharan Africa, with a clear concentration of the Sahel region. So, as we have said in the introduction, 43% of all terrorist attacks occur in the Sahel region, and basically that's only two countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, with huge increases in the past year. And of course, Afghanistan is still number one on the index, but we can, this is just because, we keep track of the impact of terrorism over 5 years. Now with the Taliban out of the index, this is going to fade away progressively in the coming years. And you could imagine that maybe already in the next edition of the terrorism index, and definitely in 2 years, it will be a country of the Sahel region, which will be on the top of the global terrorism index. Next. That's a very interesting graph. So about 98% of all terrorist attacks occurred in a country which is engaging or which is affected by conflict, and within a 50-kilometer range of this conflict also. We see that most of the conflicts throughout the world, and especially the regions most affected, are conflicts of an insurgent character. From a theoretical perspective, an insurgency comes in 4 phases. The third phase is the increased, or I would say very intensive use of terrorism to profoundly destabilize a society, which is leading to phase 4, and that's the insurgency group taking over government and basically becoming the new ruler. Perfect example, Afghanistan, August 2021, and of course a period before. So clearly it's conflict which is driving terrorism. You need to see terrorism, especially in this context, as a crystallization of another form of violence. It's only one form of violence used in a broader spectrum, and it's clearly also a form of violence that is going to support the insurgency techniques and procedures used by those groups. When you look at the number of casualties generated by conflict, you see that they are still way higher than anything that can be generated by a terrorist group, and therefore the correlation is really conflict is generating the use of terrorism, or at least the techniques called terrorism. Next. This is a slide that is basically also supporting the explanation of which was given by Brianna about the intersection between the impact of ecological threats and the use of terrorism. The color code is showing you the impact of famine or food insecurity in the Sahel region. Well, you clearly see that when you talk about Mali, for example, which is this country completely green completely to the west, well, you can clearly see that not the entire country is affected by the intersection of those different factors. Same thing is valid for Burkina Faso, which is just next to it. You clearly see that in the border region between the countries, and also within the countries, on, I would say, fringe levels or friction levels between different groups, different ethnic entities, even different languages, different religions. This is how you will see the potential for violence, and of course the crystallization, as I said before, within some form of violence that could be called terrorism. Well, you can clearly see on this map the correlation between destabilization and impact of terrorism, or impact of food insecurity, and all other factors, with the number of terrorist attacks in exactly the same geolocation. So clearly they're showing us that we need to address the systemic destabilization to also alleviate the impact of terrorism. Next. Well, we want to, thank you, Brianna. We want to finish this presentation with some kind of a positive note. Clearly, when we look at the impact in the MENA region, so that this is minus 57% of all that globally between 2016 and 22. So going from 57% to 12%. So a huge decrease in the MENA region since the peak in 2016. And that is clearly linked to the security crash imposed on the two countries, basically, Syria and Iraq, imposed on the Islamic State. Next. And of course, if you look at the different terrorist groups active in the MENA region, well, you can clearly see that Islamic State is still the most impactful, but compared to the impact it had before, and clearly also Al-Qaeda in the same region, before the peak or before the security crash, which started at the end of 2014 and clearly through 2015 and 16. Well, clearly the impact, which was completely different, it's really reduced at the moment, but it's still present. And I would like to maybe finish my presentation by saying that the security crashes are really, really effective. As you can see, it has a clear impact on the decrease of the potential for those terrorist groups to really become active and create a lot of mayhem and use a lot of violence. But during the time of security crash, because the security crash cannot go on for a long, long period of time, it cannot go on internally. Well, you need to use the time of the effects of the security crash to rebuild those societies. So we need to put back together the fabric, the social fabric of those societies, really taking away the fertile soil for those terrorist groups to become active, to recruit, to radicalize, and to use violence. We have seen, and definitely also, Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria is a good example of this. We have seen 3 consecutive security crashes, all followed by a new peak of terrorism. If you do not take away the fertile soil, if you do not rebuild societies during the impact, the positive impact of the security crash, well, those groups are flexible enough and opportunistic enough to just start again where they left it, start again where they stopped. We have seen that throughout the world. We have seen that in northeastern Nigeria with Boko Haram. And I fear that if we do not build up those societies in Syria and Iraq or other places, we will see the same phenomenon from these groups taking up again in numbers as soon as we release the security crash. So that's something that we need to understand. Security, yes, but it's only part of the solution. You need to have a nation building. You need to have a socio-economic society building exercise also during the same period of time. Next. Well, if you are interested in what we just produced, everything, the PowerPoint, the report, the interactive map, everything is accessible on our website called visionofhumanity.org. You can, of course, follow us on social media. And I would like to, I would say, before handing over back to Lisa, I would like to say a couple of things about my personal experience also. As said, I've been an officer for 30 years within the Belgian army and within NATO before, transiting or transferring into a civilian life and working now for the Institute for Economics and Peace. I've worked extensively. I'm Belgium, so really the center of Europe, but I've lived a long time in Germany also, and worked there for NATO and together with the German armed forces. And I was really fortunate to also being able to attend the General Staff Course, so the War College in Germany for 2 years, in Hamburg, Germany for 2 years. And I think they have a concept, of course, it's a concept that has been imposed by the winners of the Second World War, really clearly at the Second World War, in the restructuring of the German army. They have a concept now when it comes to be an officer in the German army, and it's a concept of civilian in uniform or gentleman in uniform. And I think this is really important for the work that you do, the work that I've been doing also as a military, is to understand that we represent our society. The people are looking at us, looking at our actions on a daily basis, and that before being a soldier or before being a police officer, we're also mothers and fathers. We're also civilians, basically living the same life than all the people within our community, but we have a special role within this community, both as a military or as an officer, as a soldier, or like you do within the police forces. We have a role as a civilian, and we also have a special role in our capacity in the work that we do on a daily basis. And I thought this was a nice concept, and it was basically a concept imposed by the Allied nations to really keep the potential for violence down within the German society after the Second World War, and we have been quite successful doing so. So you don't take away the identity, but you clearly concentrate on this position as civilian or gentleman in, or I would say lady in uniform. The second point that I would like to make before handing over, and that's a point that came absolutely naturally when we briefed these global trends to the global trends section of NYPD about on last Thursday. Well, clearly, when you listen to them, they automatically explain to us what you guys have just presented to us is absolutely global, and those figures are global. But in a country, in a city like New York, for example, even my city, Brussels, we have more than 150 nationalities represented. So basically, what's happening in the world, well, what we see in our cities or what we see in our communities is some kind of an extract of what's happening in the world, or it's like a new picture of what's happening in the world, because the world is coming to our cities, the world is coming to our communities, or certain form of conflicts through migration, through migration are also coming to our societies and coming to our communities. For example, in Brussels, when do we have the largest violence problem in our cities? Well, when African football teams are playing, during the last World Cup when Morocco was playing, there was always mayhem in the streets of Brussels afterwards. So clearly, what's happening in the rest of the world has an impact in our societies also. And I was explaining to you before that we do this double approach, mitigate, but also create resilience. Well, a lot of the workshops that we do in Positive Peace is going to really target those migrant communities within our societies, because there's not only money going back as remittance to the country of origin, but there's also a new model that those people are discovering, a model of stability, a model of democracy, which also goes back, and the ideas go back to the remittances, to the countries of origin. So the work that we do through Positive Peace, or the work that you do within your societies and within your communities, with those migrant groups, with those different ethnic groups, coming from conflict regions, coming from regions impacted by violence, impacted by terrorism, what is also the example that we can give them in the organization of our society, in a more peaceful society. Well, that's also an example that goes back to the countries of origin through a system of remittances. So Lisa, I will leave it there. Brianna, you can come back to the normal screen, please. Lisa, I will leave it there. Thank you again for the opportunity to brief you and your colleagues today, and really a pleasure and honor for IAP to be part of this presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful, Serge. Well, some takeaways for us here in the US. Number one, you can't overlook the systemic conditions which give rise to terrorism and violence. That number two, American cities are a little glimpse of what's going on in the world, and increasingly so. And number three, the idea of gentlemen in uniforms, I think is wonderful in our work in terms of Police to Peace. So now we'll hear more about that from Chief Jim Bierman. He has a couple of comments about how you can increase your knowledge about threats which you can employ locally. A little bit about Jim's background. Many of you have heard him speak before on briefings or around the nation. Chief Jim Bierman is a 40-year veteran of policing who served as president of the National Police Foundation from 2012 to 2019, now called the National Policing Institute in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he was chief of police for the Redlands, California Police Department for 13 years until 2011. Chief Jim Bierman is currently a strategic site liaison for the National Public Safety Partnership of the Department of Justice, among other roles he plays around the nation. Jim, would you like to share a few comments?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And thank you guys for your presentation. I found it really fascinating. What I like to do is just comment very briefly about trying to connect the dots between this presentation about terrorism primarily in other countries and your responsibilities as police leaders and policing in this evolving democracy in this country. And I'd like to do that with a quick story that affected my city and my region back at the end of 2014. So let me first set the stage. Redlands is a wonderful college town of about 80,000 people, located about an hour east of Los Angeles at the base of the San Bernardino Mountains. It's a great place. A lot of Eastern influence. It was founded by people from the East Coast. It's has contiguous borders with the city of San Bernardino, which happens to be the county seat of the county of San Bernardino, which is a wonderful place. It's the largest county in the continental United States. It's humongous. And that's where all the county buildings are. So the two people I'd like to focus on for just a second, their names were Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik, husband and wife. He was a Pakistani of Pakistani ancestry, but he was an American citizen born here in the United States. And she was a Pakistani national who was here on a green card, married him, met him over the internet, married him, had a very young child at the time of this incident in December of 2014. And they lived in a condo on a street that I had driven by, I don't know, maybe 2,000 times, but maybe more than that. I happen to have grown up in Redlands. This is where I am right now. Their condo was 50 yards from a preschool and probably 75 yards from the place that I would, what had been the local newspaper, where I had been a newspaper boy for a long time. Their condo was probably an eighth of a mile from the downtown core area of Redlands, the historic part of it, where every Thursday there's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people congregating for a thing called market night. And I tell you this because I think one of the big questions for the investigators after this incident was why they, if they were looking for a high body count, why they didn't just go to market night where they would have killed many more people. But fortunately for Redlands, they didn't. So on December 2nd, the husband was a county employee and had been at a Christmas party, which he was a man. It was a mandatory attendance, and he objected to that. His wife objected to that, and that may be what triggered this and why they went there as opposed to going someplace else that would have been even more dramatic than what they did. In the middle of the afternoon, he left the party, came back to Redlands, picked up his wife, went back. They were both armed with assault rifles that had been modified. California has a law that requires assault rifles to have a button, a push button to release the magazine. Makes it difficult to change magazines quickly. That had been modified. When they searched their car after the incident was over, they found almost 3,000 rounds in there. So they were clearly intending to do something more extreme than what they did. So they returned to the party, walked in and promptly shot 36 people, killing 14 of them, and then fled. Some of the survivors, even though they had changed their clothes, they were dressed in black, they were wearing masks, it was difficult to identify them visually. Some of the people in the meeting that survived this attack recognized him as a coworker from his gait, his stature, and his voice. The police set up a surveillance so he was quickly identified. They set up a surveillance of their apartment back in Redlands. And during that brief period of time, they had come back to Redlands and they saw them leave. So they started following them. They figured out they were being followed. At this point, the Redlands police marked units got in behind them and the pursuit was on, and they were heading, it appeared, back to the scene of the attack, which at this point now had hundreds of cops, had a command post, and nobody really knows if they were trying to martyr themselves in a big attack at the police command post or what, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense that they would go back there. They had left several bombs at the scene and that were remote controlled. They didn't work. They were not very good bomb makers, but the supposition was that they were going to set these off after the first responders arrived, so that there would be this secondary attack. This case, you may have read something about it. They had iPhones that were locked. The FBI tried to get Apple to unlock the iPhones. They wouldn't do it. There was a huge brouhaha over this. The FBI eventually was able to find a private company of white hat hackers to get into the phone. And somehow along the way, they were able to actually track the movement of them. And it looked like that immediately after the attack, they'd stayed in the area, probably trying to trigger the bombs. When that was unsuccessful, then they came back home and they took off. So they're heading back in this big pursuit with a bunch of cops behind them back to the scene. They stop in a residential area. Were driving an SUV. They engage the sheriff's deputies and the Redlands police and the San Bernardino police in a lengthy gun battle. Ultimately, they were killed. A couple of cops were wounded, and there were bombs in the vehicle, and then the whole thing starts to be investigated by just about everybody. I think some of the comments Serge made are really important here as we think about this example or other examples of domestic terrorism. Obviously, the focus of the presentation was on what happens internationally, but I think all of you are clearly aware of the impact that cell phones, the internet, and social media have had on policing in terms of how quickly information moves from place to place. Literally, you can be on one side of the country, an event happens, and within minutes, hours, you have protests or some reaction on the other part of the country. I'm old enough and have been in policing long enough to have spent a large share of my career before the internet, before cell phones and smartphones and social media. In fact, I have vivid recollections of one night I was a patrol lieutenant working nights when I discovered the internet and bounced all over the world on websites, and I thought that was the most amazing thing in the world. But this has changed how policing in this country, I think, thinks about itself and has to deal with issues that have no direct bearing on what is happening in your agency or your community, but can be impacted. For instance, when the New York Police Department was involved in the death of a guy named Eric Gardner over the sale of cigarettes, the next day, LAPD is having to deal with massive protests on the freeway, down on the surface streets. It had nothing to do with LAPD, right? But it had to do with these very prominent images that we saw. And the same thing happened in the Minneapolis incident involving this guy named George Floyd and the Minneapolis cop. There were protests literally all over the world as a result of that. And that happens via social media and the images that people consume. The FBI, back to this Redlands incident, labeled this couple as homegrown violent extremists, homegrown violent extremists inspired by foreign terrorist groups. And that was almost exclusively the Islamic State. And you just heard a lot of conversation and a lot of presentation about the Islamic State. The FBI said that they became radicalized over several years prior to the attack, consuming poison on the internet, and expressed commitment to jihad and martyrdom in private messages to each other. They were not part of any formal terrorist group. They weren't working for the Islamic State, but they were inspired by them. They were not on any terrorism watch list. The local cops didn't know anything about them, and the FBI didn't know anything about them. They came out of the blue, inspired by things you just saw and you heard about, to commit this horrific act. These low frequency, high impact events, 9/11, the police issues I just talked about, George Floyd, etc., or this kind of terrorism, doesn't happen very often. And because there is a constant churn of police leadership in this country and cops, we have a pretty finite length of time in our careers. Frequently, these are very new. Redlands had never had, it had its share of crime. San Bernardino is a crime-ridden city, and we can't escape that here. But Redlands had never dealt with a terrorist incident before, a legitimate terrorist incident before. San Bernardino had never experienced that. Not long after that, San Bernardino had another kind of an incident involving something a little bit similar, involving a school and a shooting in a school. But this region had never really seen something like that. So I'm not sure that the local police were necessarily prepared for it. And it was an interesting experience we did at the Police Foundation, an after action report on it. It was not critical, but pointed out many of the challenges, policing challenges involved in something like this that had not ever happened. It was a very novel event for them, but had clear connections to terrorism outside the country. And I think this is exactly why presentations like this are so important, right? It is incumbent on you as police leaders to be the expert on community safety and public safety in your community, wherever that happens to be. And are you likely to experience one of these events if you don't live in a major urban center with a very large immigrant population? Probably not. You're probably going to get through your career without that happening. But if you go back and talk to the chief in Redlands, so he was the guy who succeeded me in Redlands, and ask him that same question before this event, he said, yeah, probably it's not going to happen. And then it did. And so I think one of the questions that everybody had is, how did this couple do this? They were making bombs in their garage. They lived in a condo, so their neighbors were literally on the other side of the wall. They lived with their mother, her mother, I guess it was. I'm trying to remember. I think it was her mother. And they had this little child that they loved. It was an infant. How did nobody know about this? And so I think there's a couple of things as police leaders that I think you all have to kind of consider and think about. And obviously you get this or you wouldn't be on this presentation today. But first of all, this can happen anywhere. Secondly, as Sturge was commenting in the presentation, helped to highlight, people get inspired and radicalized remotely now. You don't have to be in the Middle East, even though this couple had gone to Saudi Arabia. She was Pakistani national and he was of Pakistani ancestry. They were radicalized via the internet and they developed their ideas. They lived in Redlands. This is not some war zone. This is not the center of poverty. There's no water issues. There's no, I mean, we have a drought, but everybody has water, right? Everybody has food. There's social services. The place they lived is a nice place. This is an upper middle income neighborhood they lived in. It's a really nice place. They were not suffering from any of the things that Sturge pointed out in Western Africa that are creating the petri dish for all of these problems. They were radicalized via the internet, the same social media, the same kind of things that you guys have to deal with people formulating their opinions about the police and how they construct their own model for trusting and having confidence in the police. Trust and confidence, I think, is a huge issue in policing today. And it's a super issue when you have people who might be radicalized and want to engage in some kind of extremist behavior or terrorist behavior where other people know. You know, we have this phrase that kind of became popular after 9/11, see something, say something. So you can't do a whole lot about people seeing things. They see things or they don't. They hear things from their neighbors. There were people who suspected that the 9/11 hijackers and terrorists were up to something and kept their mouths shut about it. I'm not clear enough about whether the neighbors knew any of this. I happen to be friends with their landlord. She's a realtor and I didn't realize she owned this condo until I went down there and talked to her. But she had no idea and she rented to these people, right? But once people do become aware of some suspicious activity, how do we motivate them to say something? The whole framework, Lisa alluded to this and Serge was talking about the officers as gentlemen kind of approach, is really what Police to Peace is about, this repositioning, this transition of cops from being law enforcement officers to peace officers, which is really what they're known by statute in almost all of the states in this nation. And how does that make sense from a trust and confidence perspective in the community, especially with immigrants who come from places where the police are not the good guys? They're not people you can trust, right? And so how do immigrants make that transition from the mindset about police from their country of origin to the police in this country, and how do we make that transition so that they will say something and do it in a way that doesn't neuter the police, that doesn't eliminate the necessity to enforce some laws, and doesn't demonize those same people that risk their lives every day for perfect strangers. But how do we create that kind of an environment, I think, has a direct linkage back to understanding local domestic extremism, whether they're from the extreme right that's developing in this country, depending on where you're at, or terrorism that has international connections. This is the challenge of policing today. It is much more complicated than when I started in the 70s. And even I've been retired as a chief for about 10 years. And it is much more complicated today than it was even 10 years ago for all kinds of reasons that I've just alluded to. So I guess I'd like to applaud all of you for even being here. There are 18,000 police leaders in this country. Most of them are not on this presentation and not paying, I think, enough attention to the growing number of extremists in this country, whether they have international connections or they're just homegrown extremists. But we certainly, the news is full of examples of these folks, everything from people trying to kidnap a governor to other kinds of things in this that we read about all the time. So that's it. That's kind of my rambling thing, but I thought it would be interesting to make this connection to how these are not abstract comments. If they're the people that survived the shooting and many of who were killed lived in Redlands, even though I didn't mention that, there's a direct connection between Redlands and that terrorism, legitimate terrorist act that took 14 lives and forever changed the lives of hundreds of people here. So there you go. Have a great day.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that. Before we go into questions, I'm just going to share with you a couple of resources that we are going to be providing you. And that is, number one is, this is developed by Jim. It's a mental health response gun violence triangle for helping to identify people who may be at risk for violence. We'll also be sharing with you this webpage, which has all of the resources on it, including the recording from this session, as well as the PowerPoint and many others. If you do not follow terrorism and extremism, you may not have seen this. The GAO, Government Accountability Office, just came out with a very comprehensive report on the rising threat of domestic terrorism in the US, including infrastructure, a very interesting document, as well as ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Her annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community is quite interesting. We'll include that as well. And then this is interesting, the Psychology of Terrorism, which is an OJP, Office of Justice Programs report, should be very interesting for people who are interested in following up on this. And we will have many more resources, as well as other webinars on this topic. And so now we have the opportunity to take questions. You can raise your hand or use the raised hand feature. I do have a couple of questions which occurred in the chat, which people messaged me privately. And so if anybody has a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand now. Otherwise, we'll take questions from the chat. Okay, great. Then the first question from the chat is, where do I get more information about local strategies for threat preparation for domestic terrorism? Well, we shared some of them, but maybe Jim, if you have a couple of comments about that, and then maybe Serge and Brianna might as well.
Sorry about that. Having some technical challenges. You know, I would take a long, hard look at the things you just put up, Lisa, for people that are interested in that. FBI, DHS, the Secret Service all have produced documents and have materials and resources that are valuable to this. You know, I think all of this stuff sits on a continuum, so I wouldn't get too caught up in just labeling resources or materials you're interested in just terrorism, but things like active shooters and extremism and all of that is all kind of in this bucket, and it just exists on a continuum. So I would start there.
Wonderful. Serge and Brianna, do you have any input for the question about local resources for the US based on your experience?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we are not neither Brianna nor me are specialists of the US, but definitely specialists on what terrorism and extremists can generate. I think I would come back with this idea mitigate on one hand and definitely enhance the resilience on the other end. This is where the IP's concept of positive peace comes in. This is how we train people. There is a Positive Peace Academy available online on the website that I mentioned in the presentation, civilvisionofhumanity.org. It takes about 2 hours to go through the principles of this concept and systemic analysis of peace. And of course, this can be trained, this can be developed, and this can be applied to your community also. And if your community becomes more resilient, if your community is generating less grievances, well, you will also see less potential for violence to emerge. And that's exactly the kind of positive feedback loops that we would like to see happening throughout the world, but also through your communities. If your communities is less violent, well, you can invest less in containing this violence, and this I would say bucket of money can then be reinvested in positive peace, and that's clearly this the type of virtuous circle or positive feedback loop that we would like to see happening. So it's not only, of course, everything that you have produced. I think gives you a very rounded approach and information about what terrorism is and who is committing those attacks and those kind of things. But I think it's also very important to make sure that you have a more anti-terrorist approach, making sure that nobody develops the idea to become a terrorist, and therefore, in this pyramid of radicalization or recruitment that you could set up, where you start with like normal society when everybody gets frustrated from time to time, some advocate and then some advocates get frustrated. Well, this is where the recruitment starts. This is where the radicalizers are coming in. So what we want to make sure is to keep the people in the lower parts of this pyramid. Just make sure that they get frustrated about the results of the baseball and football over the weekend, but not about really something essential in their life and in their community. So that's what we need to do, is become better as a society, better as a community, and keep the levels of violence down, and automatically the levels of terrorism, as I explained, which is just a form of violence, are going to be kept down also.
Right. Well, thank you, Serge. And we do have a question from Michael Parker, which relates to that, and that is, significant efforts have been made to decrease terrorism around the world, and in some areas terrorism has decreased, but are there studies showing what is working well to decrease terrorism? And maybe, Serge, following on with your comments about the societal impacts, maybe you could point us to some studies, or we'll include them in the materials. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, clearly, that's what I just said. It's like you need to make sure that you create a society in which the levels of violence are down. And that's one thing. The second thing we need to do is take care of conflict throughout the world. Our global peace index is currently at the lowest potential level it has ever been. The expectations in the coming years are going to continue to go down. And we have seen that 98% of all terrorist attacks occurred in a country or in a situation affected by conflict. So we need to address conflict throughout the world, but also conflict within our own society and our own community. Created a more peaceful and more resilient environment, and in which, of course, the use of terrorism and other forms of violence will be reduced also. So that's you need to look at the main drivers there. The main drivers are the conflict, and the other main driver, the remaining few percent, would be political terror, and that's really easy to understand. Also, if you advocate for a cause and you have a wide array of potential legal democratic tools to influence your governments or to influence authority, well, you will stay within these legal and democratic tools. If you live in a system applying political terror on you, well, the number of potential assets to influence your authority is going to be reduced to a bare minimum, and therefore the decision point to turn violent to defend your cause is going to come much faster. It's not rocket science. It's just like psychology, and I was really pleased to see this source that you will provide. It's psychology. It's understand how people turn violent, and I guess we have on screen today a lot of specialists. And before handing over the floor to you, Lisa, I would like to take this opportunity also in the name of the Institute for Economics and Peace to thank every police officer in the webinar today for the service they bring to their community and the positive attitude that they want to bring into their service. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Serge, and thank you, everyone. We will end this now. I will say on a positive note, if there is one, what Serge pointed out worldwide, and that is security operations do work. in communities. They do work in entire countries when they're well executed and when they take into account the whole of community or whole of country approach. That can be done in the US. And so after this, as I mentioned, we'll be emailing or texting you or messaging you over LinkedIn if that's where you came in, the link to the website where all our resources are, also all of our contact information so that you can reach out to any one of us. We are here to help. We are all nonprofits. And I just want to thank all the professionals at Institute for Economics and Peace, Chief Jim Bierman, everybody who took the time to be on this webinar today, and stay safe out there. Thank you, everyone.